Okay, I think we can begin. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's online event, Dante in the 21st Century. My name is James Schwarten. I've been a lecturer in Italian and Italian Studies at John Cabot University since 2012, where I've taught the comedy since 2016. I'm joined here today by two of my colleagues, Professors Fabrizio Conti and Allison Grimaldi Donahue, in remembrance of Dante, if we ever needed a reason to do so, on the occasion of the 700th anniversary of his death in 1321. Today, we offer three 15-minute general reflections on aspects of Dante in the comedy. Beginning with myself, I'll offer perspectives on teaching the comedy in recent years at John Cabot University. Then Professor Conti will speak about magic and astrology in Dante and in his own time. And Professor Grimaldi Donahue will conclude the event with a presentation of two examples of translations of the comedy. In the interest of time, I will leave to my colleagues any further details about their specific interventions as we move forward. Before we begin, however, I'd also like to acknowledge very briefly the support of two colleagues in organizing today's event, Federica Capoferri in the Modern Languages and Literature Department, and Carlos Duz in the English Language and Literature Department. I'd also like to thank Danette Anderson and her staff in the JCU Marketing Department for their work in planning this event. Feel free to use the chat function for any questions. We will conclude with a Q&A session. And now I will share my screen. And we can begin. Okay, I'm speaking today on the basis of my personal teaching experiences, having taught the comedy in English in recent years at JCU. In my course, we cover virtually all of the Inferno, most of Purgatory, and key cantos of Paradise. The goal of my discussion is to share some insights from the perspective of my classroom in the interest of providing a glimpse of what lies ahead to any students who might be interested in enrolling in the course or to anyone who's considering to embark on the comedy's journey. I should also clarify that the poem is the sole focus of my course. It's not part of a survey course in Italian literature or a general course in world literature or classical traditions. As an educator here in Italy, I'm also fortunate to be able to offer my students a day trip to Florence in order to provide an opportunity to see firsthand the related context for understanding the poem. I'd like to begin by referencing some of the challenges I've encountered while guiding students through a close reading and discussion of the comedy. Any of you present here today who have taught the comedy will perhaps share some of the same insights. First, several different translations are available, including online, and each comes with its own set of costs and benefits, we might say. Inevitably, despite my suggestion and urging to purchase the book, I've always requested the Mandelbaum translation myself, especially for the price, but also because I'm more interested in the narrative content than the poetic form. Students inevitably will want to save money and therefore elect to access one of the many versions available online. In the classroom, of course, this implies grappling with varying degrees of difference in how the poem is read and discussed, which can make references or readings a bit challenging. Second, and a related concern, is the difficulty that different versions can create when the need arises to undertake a close reading of a segment of the text, which might focus on a specific word choice, a turn of phrase, a verse, or tercet, that can then be used to highlight the aesthetic qualities of the poem. For example, Dante's ability to capture a mood or an emotion, to describe what is indescribable with exceptional metaphors and similes, and to convey deep truths and mysteries in comprehensible language. With regard to time concerns, there's often little time to delve into key works that help to lend more understanding to the comedy as a whole. Dante's Vita Nuova, the De Vulgari Eloquentia, Monarchia, or Convivio. Not to mention key intertexts, such as Virgil's Aeneid or the Bible. Students often find the abounding cast of characters a bit daunting. Inferno alone, with its souls and infernal monsters and beasts, contains a considerable number, which increases as we move through the other two canticles. But it's not simply the sheer number of characters that students can find a bit overwhelming. It's often their obscurity which can confound contemporary readers. Liken it to a sort of dark thicket of their own, similar to perhaps Dante's. I found that bringing the characters alive through the rich visual history tied to the comedy can be a useful strategy in maintaining students' interest and enthusiasm. I will turn to this aspect of teaching the comedy in a few minutes. One of the most challenging aspects of teaching the comedy concerns rendering justice to the poem's contemporary contexts, while at the same time maintaining awareness of its currency today. Another aspect of teaching the comedy that I will turn to shortly. Students must often be reminded that despite the poem's Christian context, it is a work of poetry, not theology. Nonetheless, studying the poem can be perceived by some students as a rather tedious exercise in comprehending religious references, although other students are drawn to the course precisely because of their religious beliefs, some of whom sometimes express their dismay or even frustration or anger toward Dante's unorthodox vision of heaven and hell. Last, accessibility. Students now have access to a wealth of information in the digital humanities, everything from research tools, such as the Dartmouth Dante Project, to critical commentary, such as Columbia University's Digital Dante, as well as the University of Texas at Austin's Dante Worlds, not to mention numerous YouTube videos and countless websites. A Google search on Dante's Divine Comedy yields nearly 1.3 million hits. If you change it to Dante Divine Comedy, that produces over 6 million, and Divine Comedy Dante nearly 5 million. When restricting the domain search on edu, these same search strings range from 46,000 to 77,000 hits. But accessibility doesn't necessarily have to be viewed as a challenge or an obstacle. It can also enhance the teaching and learning experience in instructive ways. I've learned to embrace the likelihood that students will do their own sleuthing online and have tried to transform accessibility into an effective teaching tool. Here I've provided two examples of how internet resources can facilitate teaching the comedy. In a flipped classroom scenario, for example, students can be asked to search through online commentary and questions and come to class prepared to lead a discussion or to present on a specific canto or moment in the comedy. Such online content also lends itself well to interactive pair or group work in or outside of class. A close reading and discussion of the comedy offers students the opportunity to reflect on human nature and human relations through the pilgrim's various encounters. Students often find specific dramatic moments in the comedy particularly poignant, such as Ulysses' end as deceitful advisor in Inferno 26, or Paolo and Francesca's lustful tendencies in Inferno 5, or Pier della Vigna's condemnation as a suicide in Inferno 13. Not to mention the intense humanity in the shifting relationship between Virgil and Dante, which culminates in the dramatic moment of Virgil's disappearance in Purgatory, beginning in Purgatory 27. In Purgatory, where transformation is predicated on penance, we find a growing sense of mutuality, as Dante the Pilgrim learns that sharing means having more, not less, and that love and light are key transformative powers. As much of the comedy's concern is about the notion of justice, both human and divine, Dante addresses both vileness and virtuosity. Inferno is concerned as much with the inability to share and the destructive nature of the ego, whereas the remainder of the poem provides what we may call a roadmap to redemption, as the focus shifts to the importance of we and us, as we see in this example from Purgatory 15. In keeping with the title of today's event, I'd like to spend some time on the currency of Dante today. More specifically, what does Dante offer us as readers in 2021? On this 700th anniversary of his death, some would argue that his is an important and crucial voice in the contemporary age. Dante's fraudulent counselors may find resonance with students in the current era of fake news. Sowers of discord, students may see in today's social media trolls. And with reference to what may be Dante's foremost concern, today we continue to find examples of corruption in the spiritual and temporal spheres. As in Dante's time, the church today continues to struggle with corruption. Though the specific dynamics of corruption may have changed, and Dante's invectives were directed specifically toward the papacy, Dante perhaps wouldn't be surprised to read this recent headline from Reuters. Inferno 22 is concerned with the sin of beartry, or trafficking in public office. As many of you know, Dante was exiled from Florence precisely on such grounds, along with charges of bribery, taking vengeance on his political rivals, and other unsubstantiated crimes. And is this sin of trafficking in public office, to which he dedicates the most space in the comedy. Dante also continues to make headlines, both far and wide. A reversal of the poet's conviction may even be forthcoming this year. Some students inevitably consider enrolling in the course given personal intellectual pursuits, such as mythology, theology, medieval history, or classical studies. And as such, they're already expecting to find elements of those areas in the course. Yet there's another aspect of the rich history tied to the comedy that students often don't anticipate. And it's one that can enhance the classroom experience and provide instructive teaching moments. That is the centuries-long illustrative tradition. Students are often unaware of how present Dante is in today's world, or maybe how he's been co-opted in today's world. And everything from campaigns to reduce water consumption here, to special edition ice cream bars, or to enduring references on the internet and elsewhere, the dreaded laundry 10th circle. As students move through the course, however, they often begin to question today's world more and more, and the sins that Dante would consider worthy of condemnation. In recent semesters, I found that environmental crimes and disrespect for the natural environment often figure prominently in students' minds. And some students have compared Dante's own exile from Florence to recent trends in migration of people from their homelands. Turning to the rich visual tradition again, it also provides opportunities to critique those works in class, questioning, for example, how faithfully they represent the text. In this illustration, we find ourselves at the outset of Dante's journey, between cantos 1 and 3, in which Dante the Pilgrim doubts his worthiness to undertake the journey through the afterlife. he's heartened in hearing Beatrice's announcement that three ladies from heaven, Mary, Lucy, Lucia, and Rachel, depicted in the upper portion of this image, have sent Virgil to help him overcome his fear and to accompany him along his way. In this depiction, we also see the gate of hell and Mount Purgatory. I found that this sort of visual material can enhance the experience, especially for visually oriented learners. I asked students, for example, to discuss how closely an illustration mirrors the canto, what the differences are there, and what illustrations' limitations are, what they can or cannot tell us about the poem. Comparing the previous depiction with more recent ones can also remind students of the myriad Dantean references in contemporary popular culture. Such examples can also allow students to gain a keener awareness of the psychological dimension of the poem. As the comedy, especially Inferno, is perhaps more widely known than it is read, students who have taken the course ultimately find that its perceived challenges can transform into benefits. Students also express the gratification in gaining an understanding of one of the most renowned pieces of world literature, one which continues to remain relevant over 700 years later. As they contemplate some of the comedy's key themes, such as the notion of justice and the sense of rewards and punishments for doing wrong and right, or how to deal with corruption in society, or the difficulties one might encounter while trying to achieve personal happiness, or the sense of outrage that Dante must have felt after having been wrongly exiled from Florence, but also the sense of hope that grows as he makes his way out of the dark wood and into the light. On the basis of my teaching experience, in the final analysis, I found that there's something there for every student of the comedy. Here I've offered two examples from my course evaluations. And with that, I believe my time has come to an end. So I will now pass the microphone and screen sharing over to my colleague, Fabrizio Conti. I would just like to introduce him properly. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay. Fabrizio Conti is a lecturer in history at John Cabot University. He received a dual PhD in history and medieval studies from Central European University, Budapest, in 2011. He's published the monograph Witchcraft, Superstition, and Observant Franciscan Preachers, Pastoral Approach and Intellectual Debate in Renaissance Milan, with Brepols in 2015, and the edited book, Civilizations of the Supernatural, Witchcraft, Ritual, and Religious Experience in Late Antique, Medieval, and Renaissance Traditions, with a foreword by Teofilo F. Ruiz, with Trivent Publishing in 2020, along with Professor Elizabeth Ann Pollard from San Diego State University. Fabrizio is currently editing the volume, There Is No One Who Does Not Fear to Be Spellbound, Magic in the Roman World, 8th century BCE to 5th century CE, which will be published this year by Trivent Publishing. The title of his talk today is The World and the Heavens, Magic and Astrology in Dante and in His Own Time. Fabrizio, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for this too kind introduction. Actually, thank you everybody here thanks to all those who have contributed to give shape to this amazing event, really. So yeah, my presentation is going to be about the world and the heavens, magic and astrology in Dante, and is in his own times. It's not going to take 1 hour, so no worries about that. But anyway, I hope that I will manage to say something interesting and useful. So first of all, Dante Alighieri is a source of inspiration. He was a man from the Middle Ages, a source of inspiration for many of us still today, many students, scholars. He was a man between this world and the other, if I can say. So he was, first of all, a man from this world for sure, because he was totally engaged in the political, historical, social events of his own times. He participated in the Battle of Campaldino, for instance, in 1289, where the Welsh and the Ghibellines fought one against the other in that beautiful part of Tuscany, which actually I could visit many times, which is not far from Arezzo. You can imagine battle taking place there in that atmosphere, in that environment, that foggy landscape with Dante fighting against his enemies. He actually was among the victorious Guelphs, the ones who endorsed the papacy, as opposed to the others, the Ghibellines, who they endorsed the other camp, the other side, the other political side of the times, the emperor, the empire. He had some troubles pretty soon in Florence, when his own political group, his own political party, the Guelphs actually, split up into different parts, the blacks and the whites. And the white, Dante, was exiled for life, as we know, in 1302, while he was in Rome at the court of Pope Boniface VIII. From this world to the next, so from this world to the other world, Dante presenting his Divine Comedy to Florence, as it was imagined by Domenico of Michelino, 1465, in this beautiful fresco in the Cathedral of Florence, Santa Maria del Fiore. So you have all the main elements here. Dante himself with his own text, presenting his own text to the city of Florence, and the representation of the three kingdoms of the other world, Inferno, the Purgatory, and the Paradiso. Magic and astrological traditions. Dante was a man of the Middle Ages, from the medieval times, of course, and magic and astrology were really there, were really at the center of the culture of the time. He had an interesting type of culture, Dante Alighieri. Really, he could receive an interesting kind of education, of learning. He could read for sure Alfargani, the 9th century astrologer, proto-scientist, if we can consider him as such, from Baghdad, who actually wrote this compendium of the science of the stars, which is nothing else than a revision, translation, another version of the Almagest by Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE, Common Era. And we find, interesting traces of these different traditions in both in the Divina Commedia, but also in Dante's Convivio. Other names of important astrologers, magicians, intellectuals of that time were that of Pietro d'Abano, but especially of Cecco d'Ascoli. Cecco d'Ascoli was a physician, the court of John the 22nd. He also published a commentary to the already famous text by John the Sacred Gospel, the Sphere of the World, but especially was pretty much popular, Cecco d'Ascoli, because he actually had something to say about Dante. He had something to say against Dante. I would say he attacked Dante because he thought that Dante held a firm belief in determinism. So against the principle, the idea of free will, especially Cecco d'Ascoli based his own view, this negative view on Dante, on a passage from the Inferno, Inferno 789. Necessità la fa essere veloce. Necessity makes her, which is fortuna, swift. And so in his famous Acerba, Cecco d'Ascoli says, each heaven does not determine the soul by necessity as it moves, but only impresses a certain disposition on the human creature. So it was intended to be something against what Dante had supposedly said in the passage of Inferno. In this, you see, Cecco said to Dante, Florentine poet, positing that the goods of fortune are assigned by necessity, the soul having been created in liberty, fortune has no power over it that could contradict its will. So another kind of blow against Dante, who actually, as this passage is from Purgatory 16, actually had a different idea of the problem of free will and the relevance, the role of astrology. We can be pretty sure about that. So as Dante and his own guide, Virgil, poet, proceed down the road towards the paradise, and they are passing through the Purgatory, actually they meet, in the third terrace, they meet Marco Lombardo. This individual, this guy about whom we don't really know too much, was probably courtier from Lombardy. And actually, through the words of Marco Lombardo, there is this reaffirmation of free will. So the reaffirmation of what had to be the real thought of Dante concerning this central problem. So it's a rebuttal of astrological determinism. In a way, we read here in this passage from Purgatorio 16, ye who are living every cause refer still upward to the heavens, as if all things, they of necessity moved with themselves. If this were so, in you would be destroyed free will, nor any justice would there be in having joy for good or grief for evil. The heavens, your movements do initiate, I say not all, but granting that I say, light has been given you for good and evil, and so forth. So that should represent Dante's view concerning that central problem of the relationship between free will and the role of astrology. And we are to be reminded that astrology in that time was a synonym for astronomy, basically. At least that's how Dante surely employs that term. In the eighth circle of Inferno, in fact, we find that astrologers and diviners, magicians, are being punished. And they have their faces reversed and set the contrary way in their limbs. They are deprived of the power to see before them, and they are at the same time constrained to walk backward. So that's the typical contrapasso which is employed by Dante in this case, in the specific case of astrologers and diviners in Inferno's eighth circle. Among the characters being punished there in Inferno 20 said something about them. We have Michael Scotus, the astrologer of Emperor Frederick II, Guido Bonatti, who actually is an interesting character, was one of the most popular astrologers of his own times. And as Dante, Maestro Benvenuto, he was an astrologer, but actually he had been a shoemaker. So then he left his old profession in order to become an astrologer. And then there is this very brief hint, reference to some female witches, some women who could be considered witches, so unnamed female witches. We read here in Inferno 20. The next, who is so slender in the flanks, was Michael Scott, who of very magical illusions knew the game. Behold Guido Bonatti, behold Astente, who now unto his letter and his thread would fain have stuck, but he too late repents. Behold the wretched ones, who left the needle, the spool and rock, and made them fortune tellers. They wrote their magic spells with herb and image. This is very meaningful, I think. This last verse is, behold the wretched ones who left the needle, the spool and rock, and made them fortune tellers. These are females, these are women who decided to leave the objects of their everyday life in order to embrace a new scope in their life. So they became basically fortune tellers, and there is probably in this description a shift towards the construction of the typical image of the witch that will appear only much later anyway, in the 15th century, basically. And here you have a few references to just some of the interesting developments that you have from the intellectual, theological point of view in this period. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was central in the construction of the Divine Comedy, in the theological construction of Dante's view concerning life, concerning allegory, and so forth. But for sure is also central in the construction of something else, of this demonological obsession, in this idea of heresy, which then we see also acquiring peculiar, typical kind of shape in many papal oaths, many papal juridical instruments, documents, Pope Gregory IX, Alexander IV, John the 22nd, and so forth, until Bernard Guy, who wrote the Inquisitor's Guide, targeting also sorcerers and diviners precisely. And we know how Satan was becoming Satan the heretic, as Alain Bureau actually wrote, said in his important book, The Birth of Demonology in the Medieval West. So there is an entire process of transformation of these mindsets related to how we look to alterity and how we build an image of Satan and an image of the other as the heretic in this case. And so the heretics can be found in Inferno, of course. We also find heretics there in the sixth circle. We find Farinata degli Uberti, these characters, individuals accused of being Epicurean. Their cemetery have upon this side is said in Inferno 10, with Epicurus, all his followers, would with the body mortal make the soul. That's the typical accusation cast against these Epicureans. Farinata degli Uberti, this political, military leader, and Cavalcante dei Cavalcanti, philosopher, the Emperor Frederick II himself, and also Cardinal Ottaviano degli Ubaldini. Some of them from the Ghibellin side, the other from the website. So really, Dante does not really make such huge distinction from this point of view, from the point of view of scene, in this case, of this peculiar type of fault or scene. And we have the heretics here. Proceeding towards the paradise, we also have something interesting to say. We can find something interesting to say, of course, with regard to the peculiar idea that Dante had concerning the heavens. This peculiar cosmology, which to some extent seem to be also interesting for us today, if we try to look at some words that he actually say in the paradise, in Paradiso. First of all, let's try to take a look to the typical, to the peculiar type of organization, the geography of the heaven, the paradise, with the 9 celestial spheres surrounding the art, really, endorsing the view of Ptolemy, leading to the Empyrean, with the angelic circles and with the vision of God, which is really at the end, and which is actually, as we know, the aim, the goal, the real goal, the final goal of the entire divine covenant. It's really a type of path leading from the Inferno through the Purgatory up to the paradise, to the Visio Beatifica, to the vision of God, which is, according to the representation of Dante, basically light. With voice and gesture, we read in Paradise 30, with voice and gesture of a perfect leader, she recommenced, Beatrice, of course. We from the greatest body have issued to the heaven that is pure light. The heaven is pure light, according to Dante. Light intellectual replayed with love. Love of true God replayed with ecstasy. Ecstasy that transcended every sweetness. Here shall to see the one host and the other of paradise, and one in the same aspects, which at the final judgment you shall see. Through these different celestial spheres, Dante finally is able to go towards the last step of his cammino towards the paradise, and he approaches the end, the constellation of the Gemini. The constellation of Gemini, and also the pale blue dot at the same time. The pale blue dot, the planet Earth, as it was photographed by the space probe many years ago, as we all know. So some description that we find of the art of the planet Earth there in the Paradiso, in the heaven, made by Dante, actually could recall the image of this famous popular pale blue dot as we know it today. But let's go in order. In Paradise 22, here we read, the gentle lady urged me on behind them, up where that stairway by a single sign, so did her virtue overcome my nature. So through this ladder, he can actually go up towards the upper part of the paradise, where the fixed stars are, according to the geography of the paradise on which Dante relies. And then as he approaches the constellation of Gemini, under the sign of which he was supposed to be born, actually, between May and June, he has this beautiful invocation, dedication to the Gemini. Glorious stars, he says, all light impregnated with mighty virtue, from which I knowledge all of my genius whatsoever it be. With you was born, and he them with you, he who is father of all mortal life. When first I tasted of the Tuscan air, and then when grace was freely given to me to enter the high wheel which turns you around, your region was allotted unto me. To you devotedly, at this hour my soul is singing, that it virtue may acquire for the stern past that draws it to itself. So it's a very beautiful way of really talking to the stars, to the Gemini. And here again, Dante is highlighting his own view of the stars, of their influences, of the role that the stars can have in the life of a human, of an individual like him. We know that the Gemini, the typical influence of the Gemini constellation was believed to be, something good, something usable for the poet, especially for the scholar, for the creative in a way. But here we arrive to the pale blue dot, to the planet Earth. So look down once more. Fabrizio tells Dante, and see how vast a world thou hast already put beneath thy feet. I with my side return through one and all the sevenfold spheres, and I beheld this globe such that I smiled at its ignoble semblance. That's a beautiful image. I think that I would like to really conclude my short talk about this with this image. With Dante, who is actually approaching almost the vision of God, but for a last moment, he turns back and he tries to look at all that he had passed through during this experience, and he sees the spheres, he sees the planets, and he sees also the art, and he, in the end, smiles at the art with all the issues, all the political struggles, enmities, fights that the planet Earth actually offers, and offers especially even today. I mean, of course, but it had to offer even more, we can imagine, to somebody like Dante, so eager to see the paradise, but also so much entrenched in earthly affairs in a way. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for your contribution on magic and astrology. And I think you can stop sharing. While you're doing that, I will introduce Allison. Allison Grimaldi Donahue is an educator, writer, translator, and editor. Her work has appeared in Words Without Borders, The Brooklyn Rail, Electric Literature, Arkansas International, Prairie Schooner, Flash Art, and Nero, among others. She is currently pursuing a PhD in critical thought at the European Graduate School with a thesis on translation theory. She's a regular presenter at the annual American Literary Translators Conference. This past year, she was an artist in residence at Mambo, Museum of Modern Art, Bologna. Her translation of Carla Lonzi's Autoritratto will be published in September 2021 with Divided Publishing, London. The title of Allison's talk today is Dante the Contemporary Poet. Kieran Carson and Mary Jo Bang translating Inferno.
Thank you, James. Thanks to everyone for being here and to our hosts, the Italian department and the English department and the humanities department. It's really lovely to collaborate and come together on something like this and work with colleagues who we don't always get to spend time with. So it's really nice to be here with you, Jim and Fabrizio. So yeah, I'm going to share my screen now. I'm not a Zoom expert, so this might take one moment. There we are. All right. So I'm going to be talking about Dante the Contemporary Poet. And I'm going to be looking at two translations, one by Kieran Carson and one by Mary Jo Bang, and considering them as tools for both translation and creative writing teaching in the undergraduate classroom. So Dante, translation and creative writing for students in 2021. So also thinking back to about what Jim was saying about how do we approach Dante in the classroom today with our students, and using Dante to reconnect our students to vast cultural heritage, especially at a place like John Cabot, where I have a lot of students visiting from abroad, and using Dante in the classroom to recognize that we as writers and poets are part of a tradition. Using translation in creative writing curriculums also teaches the students the mechanics of not one, but two languages. So really looking at language from the inside out, examining the architecture of structures of different forms and different practices. And it also, what I've found personally, is that it liberates students, as it has for myself, to find new voices, right? It's sort of like putting on a costume or acting. And it allows the students to express themselves very freely with using someone else's voice. So then the question becomes, what do these two fields, medieval literature and creative writing, have to do with one another, and how do they interact? For me, a lot of this has to do with an interaction I had with Caroline Bergvall's poem Via a number of years ago. And it's one of my favorite works. I'm going to play a little bit for you right now. Caroline Bergvall is an artist and writer living in the UK. She's of French and Norwegian origin. And she often reclaims, let's say, medieval literature and uses them to create new contemporary works of art. So she had a residency at the British Library in the early 2000s, and she took a number of translations that she found there and did a sort of experiment, a sound poem. And so I'm just going to play you about 30 seconds of this now.
Along the journey of our life, halfway, I found myself again in a dark wood, wherein the straight road no longer lay. Dale, 1996. At the midpoint in the journey of our life, I found myself astray in a dark wood, for the straight path had vanished. Creef and Hollander, 1989. Halfway over the wayfaring of our life, since missed the right way through a night dark wood, struggling, I found myself. Musgrave, 1893.
So you'll notice that she's just reading the first 3 lines of Inferno, followed by a last name and a date. And so she goes through this practice for about 10 minutes. And when I heard this, I thought to myself a couple of things. One, how many translations of Dante are there into English? And what are the differences between them? And it also, listening to her really made space for a different sort of experimentation. I studied medieval literature in graduate school, but then I moved to more of a creative writing field. And I always wanted to bring those things together. And it seemed like somehow she was building a space for this, right? She sort of opened that door. And so I asked, why are there so many translations of Dante's Divine Comedy? Why do people keep translating it? That was one question I had. And another question was, is it blasphemous to mess with a master? Which I think is a lot of folks' reaction when they start examining all of these different translations of Dante. Especially when I have Italian students in class, like, no, I don't want to read the translation, only to discover that the translation offers them something else, right? It offers a different sort of critical reading. To answer both of these questions, I sort of turned to one of my favorite texts and one of my favorite thinkers, Walter Benjamin, and his wonderful essay, The Task of the Translator, which I highly recommend for everyone interested in translation. And so he has 2 quotes that I wanted to share with you that sort of helped me deal with all of these translations. He writes, "For a translation comes later than the original, and since the important works of literature never find their chosen translators at the time of their origin, their translation marks their stage of continued life. The idea of life and afterlife in works of art should be regarded with an entirely unmetaphorical objectivity." So in this, he brings up 2 fantastic and fascinating ideas. One, that a translator can come thousands of years, if not hundreds, if not tens, after an original work is born. So who knows? Maybe the quote unquote best translation of Dante into English has yet to arrive, or perhaps he means that the best translation for a given time arrives at its given time. So there are always these openings for a new translation. And secondly, this idea of life and afterlife as an unmetaphorical activity in translation. By translating Dante, not only are you bringing Dante into a new culture, but you're bringing him into a new time, so a whole new audience of readers. And so then I was wondering, why do poets keep translating Dante? And one of my theories is that they want to speak to the great poet and also be like the great poet. Benjamin again. It is the task of the translator to release in his own language that pure language that is under the spell of the author, to liberate the language imprisoned in a work in his creation of that work. So the idea being that as translators, what we're looking for is some kind of kernel of pure language, which, reaching back to what Professor Conti was saying, is that there's something magical within the text. There's something pure and some kind of chemistry that happens that reaches beyond what's just there. And the task of the translator is to look for that thing, the thing that is within the language itself. So the other thing is that Dante sets the groundwork himself for having so many translations. And as I was revisiting some of the cantos recently, I had this thought. So in his philosophy of language, in De Vulgare Eloquentia, which is one of my favorite texts, he finds dignity in the vernacular, right? So he's emphasizing the importance and dignity and specialness, let's say, of each vernacular language. And by writing his own poetry in Italian rather than Latin, he's proving this point. He's proving that the everyday speech, the speech of the people, the accessible speech, is something that we can actually write beautiful poetry in. And he instructs us to join him in Canto 4, when he himself joins the chorus of great poets. And he shows us that the vernacular, our vernacular, therefore, will also have great poets. So our language of 2021 can also have this elevated sort of status. And he chooses the greatest poet to his mind to be his own guide, which I think is quite important. So this little image here is of Virgil. So in Canto 1, and this is the Bang translation, which I'll be talking about momentarily, in Canto 1, 80 through 88. I said, "You're Virgil, aren't you? You're the rainmaker who creates a torrent of speech that turns into a riptide." Then I felt bashful and hung my head. The best and the brightest in the class of poets, I read you and loved you and hope what I learned from you will now serve me well. First of all authors and master of me, I borrow from you and to you I owe a debt for the music that's brought me success. So right here in the very first canto, he's calling upon this fact that he is part of a tradition, he is part of a chain, and that he is borrowing something, right? Whether that's language, whether that is form, he is taking it from Virgil. And so he's inviting us in doing so to do the same. So who are all of these poets that are translating Dante? And when did all these translations come about? So the very first canto was translated to English in 1782 by Charles Rogers. And the first complete American translation, I say this because I'm American and I'm very interested in American poetry, was completed by William Wadsworth Longfellow in 1867. And since then, since these very first attempts, it has been translated and published in part or as a whole over 100 times. So if you go simply on the internet, you can find lists of these things. Some folks only get to translate one canto, some folks translate many. Mary Jo Bang has translated the Inferno, but now she's actually going to be publishing her Purgatory very soon. So Mary Jo Bang is an American poet born in 1946, and she's still alive. And so we're going to look at a few lines of her very postmodern, very American Dante. And Kieran Carson was born in 1948 and passed away just a couple of years ago. He was from Northern Ireland. And his translation is really interested in looking at a kind of Northern Irish sounding Divine Comedy. He turns the language into something of a song, right? He's really interested in sort of that song tradition, interested in the musicality of poetry. It's fascinating, these two translators, these two poets, were actually only born 2 years apart. And so I wanted to also share with you the covers of the books, because I think they say a lot about who these translations are marketed towards and who the readers or the potential readers might be. So this is Mary Jo Bang's version over here, Grey Wolf Press from the US, 2012, which kind of has a lot of comic book sort of imagery. And then the Granta Paperbacks 2005 edition from the UK by Kieran Carson, which sort of has a really kind of dramatic almost video game kind of thriller quality to it. And speaking of Googling Dante, if you Google just simply Dante, most of the things you find are references to video games, which is a whole different topic. So going back to Canto 4 and thinking about how these poets and Dante envision themselves in limbo with all these knowledgeable men, he inserts himself into this tradition. We have Mary Jo Bang's translation. I said, Your Honor, all the arts and sciences, Ernst and Darwin, so who are these honorific few, that they're divided from the others? He said, Heaven is impressed with the honors, and renown that still echo on earth. The favored ones maintain their distinction in limbo. So you'll notice right away that she's referencing Ernst, the artist, and Darwin, the scientist. So she's bringing in modern references to help the reader place the emphasis and place the understanding of what's going on in the poem. Then we have Carson, who's saying, O you who honor knowledge and each art, say who are these whose status gives them claim to here assemble in a sphere apart? He said to me, their honorable name resounding from the world beneath the moon has gained in heaven the reward of fame. So right away here, you'll notice that there's more of an emphasis on rhythm and that there's rhyme. And so we're focusing a bit more on song. So more from Canto 4, and I just wanted to emphasize a few things here. The last two stanzas from each section, where we notice that Dante is really inserting himself again and placing himself among the masters. My teacher said, note how the one with the sword of Achilles' letter opener in his hand walks in front of the other three. His position suggests that he's their leader. He's Homer, the reigning poet, and after him it's Horace, the satirist, then Ovid plays Tray, and Lucan is last. And my guide, with accent ceremonious, said, behold the one with the sword in hand, who fronts the three behind him like a magus. That's Homer, who's the leader of the band. The next is Horace, master of satire, Ovid third, then Lucan takes his stand. So you'll see that in Mary Jo Bang, we see someone who's trying to make a translation that's very much of the people, a colloquial sound. And in Carson, while we're still of the people, we're noticing that there's more of a song, that there's more of an incantation that brings us back perhaps to an ancient feeling. And so this is just a continued passage from this canto, which I find really fascinating because so often I think when we read the masters, we feel very distant from them and we feel like that it's inaccessible. However, when we're translating them, sometimes they make these openings for us. And it's also to be argued that once a text has been translated so many times, that there's more space to play. The translation itself can become a site for play. So she writes, Mary Jo Bang writes, I stood at the edge of Eton, of poetry, established by that lord of song, who eagle-like and high above the rest circles and glides. I think this is really interesting because now, though it's an American poem, she's referencing Eton, which perhaps she's thinking that many American readers know about, perhaps from viewing shows like The Crown or something like that. And then Carson, thus I did see the minstrels of that highest convocation of melodic air, which, like an eagle, soars above the rest. I overheard them seriously confer before they turned and nodded gravely at me, while my conductor smiled so debonair. And greatly more besides they honored me, for I was number as a poet knight, the sixth, since there were 5 of them, you see. So he inserts himself right in that little group. It's sort of like there's a click happening, and he just walks right up to them. In the Mary Jo Bang version, she writes, my teacher seemed so pleased. So he's also noticing that Virgil's giving him the nod, right? Saying, yes, join us. So the formal differences between Carson and Bang, just to highlight a few of them. Carson is a terza rima crossed with a ballad. So his form is a form. He's practicing something particular and making sure that it fits the schema. He writes about this often in the text, and as you read it aloud to yourself, you notice that there's sort of a music of Belfast when you think of Irish music, and it creates a song-like poem. Bang doesn't use a rhyme scheme, but she uses a lot of internal rhyme and other devices like alliteration and assonance. And so therefore it reads a lot closer to contemporary American poetry because she's using a lot of the same devices that American poets use today. Carson inserts his own culture primarily through sound. So he's thinking of himself almost as a troubadour. Bang inserts her own culture through references and homages, like the Darwin passage. There's also a passage about Cartman from South Park. There's also a lot of American politicians from the 2000s in there. Carson comes from a Catholic family in Northern Ireland, and so he wants to modernize the allegory, the religious allegory. And Bang focuses on a more secular model, seeking to transcend religious allegory. So I think it's quite interesting what Jim was saying in his presentation, because both of those things can be read into the translations and then therefore into different interpretations. So students can approach it from either direction. And neither of these poets uses pure terza rima, although other translators have tried to do so. Robert Pinsky, for example, most famously tried to do this. So you'll notice that Carson and Bang have different notions of fidelity and different notions of literalness, which are our kind of go-to terms when we think of translation, or at least when we're beginning to think about translation. Fidelity can mean speaking to the vernacular speech of the people and including them in the story. Literalness can also mean including certain sounds or certain rhythms of a place. So those terms are quite flexible and changeable. So then the question becomes, is one better than the other, right? We have over 100 translations to choose from. How can one be better than the other? I would say no, right? They all have their place. Translation is a place of proliferating texts where there's always room for more and there's always very little space for perfection. Something can always be changed, something can be updated. Translations go out of style. They age out of fashion while the original never does. And we have to ask ourselves why this happens. So they're rebirths, and they're also places for survival of different texts. Both languages, both Italian and English in this case, can grow and change according to these translations. And we can see different things, not only in the translation, but because of these different interpretations, we read Dante himself differently after reading them. So some concluding points. Different translations of ancient texts keep them alive and make them less precious. Right, Dante then becomes something we live with and live through. He's a poet like we are, someone who is alive and subject to mistakes. They become part of our own culture and experience and our own language. And in translating them, we become like the poets we most admire, even just for a second, right? Even just for a semester. And we learn to play with language again. We take our guard down about sharing work. When we share translations, it's only half of ourselves, right? And we experiment with new forms and get to know new cultures and histories. And so I wanted to share with you sort of an idea I had if we were in the classroom together, an exercise to try at home for aspiring translators, experimenting with Dante, right? So kind of loosening up with Dante and spending time with him in our contemporary space. One of my favorite books for thinking about translation is Raymond Queneau's Exercises in Style from 1947, which was recently translated by Barbara Wright in 2013. And so in this book, Queneau gives us a lot of different paragraphs that are all about the same thing, but written differently. So my idea is to choose 3, 6, or 9 lines from Dante's Inferno or the comedy itself, either in English or in Italian, whatever languages you're working with. So choose one or more styles borrowed from Queneau's amazing book. So I chose 3 that I thought were particularly interesting. Onomatopoeia, put an emphasis on the sounds in the passage, make words sound as they mean, even if it takes you away from traditional meaning. So in whatever passage you're looking at, examine sound. What's going on around you, what's happening when the people speak. Put an emphasis on smell, olfactory translation. Rewrite the passage in terms of scents and odors, which I think could be really fun and interesting when examining Inferno particularly. And then the official letter format. Write the lines as if they were a formal letter or an email. So see what happens when there's an addressee. How do you change your tone? How do you change your ways? So just some ideas for experimenting with translation and bringing Dante into the 21st century, hey, with us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Allison, for that. Language in Dante and from Dante and after Dante. I would just open up the floor for any questions. If anyone has anything, any curiosities to express.
Can I ask a question to Alison?
Go ahead.
Hello,
Go ahead,
Alison.
Nefeli.
Hello. Well, do I appear as Carlos Jews? Wow, I wish.
You do, you do.
Well, that's interesting. So I'll try to be more serious. So I really loved what you said, and made me think. I actually sent you a message about that, but it made me think about what a famous Spanish writer, it doesn't come to my mind now, maybe some of you know his or her name, what they said about Hamlet. And they said basically that every time that Shakespeare's Hamlet is translated into Spanish, it's because the Spanish society and culture and identity changed. So somehow Hamlet interprets every time the society it finds, and in turn it changes it. So the multiple translations that you were saying happens and are happening with Dante, I don't know how you want to factor that in, but I found it interesting, perhaps if you can find a way to, talk about it. Carlos out.
Thank you, Nafa. That's a really interesting point. Yeah, we were also having a conversation recently about all of those Shakespeare translations into Italian and how that works. So I think that's the thing, right? The culture changes and the critical aspects of what we look at in a work change. Is if we look at the scholarship of Dante over the years, the things that people are interested in is constantly changing. And so I think the same thing likely happens with translation. What we're interested in as translators and as readers changes. And so we put emphasis on those different things. Our values about what makes literature good or interesting or pleasurable also changes. So I think that's completely true. And that's why these two translations sound so different, even though they're actually from poets from the same generation. And were published within 7 years of each other, because one is from Northern Ireland and one is from the Midwest of the United States. And so their politics, the sounds that they look for in poetry, the things they value in poetry are different, and they speak to those cultures in different ways. And so then Dante becomes Irish, he becomes American. So yeah, I think what you're saying is true.
Allison, I'll just step in here for a second. I see a question for you in the chat. Laura Sheehan asks, aside from American politicians, did Mary Jo Bang put anyone interesting, and how? You decide interesting, how to define that.
So she puts everyone interesting is in hell. Yes, she puts lots of different figures in, lots of different artists, lots of different authors. The list, thinking of it now, isn't coming to mind, but there are so many different characters in there, fictional from other works of art and real. So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Christopher Kleinhans has a question.
Hi, Jim. Thanks very much to all three speakers. I learned a lot, and I appreciate it, especially in this Dante year. A couple of observations, not so much questions, but you may want to comment on them. Jim, I appreciated your mentioning the early manuscript illumination tradition, which is important to get some sort of contemporary take on how Dante was received, even soon after his death. But I think it's also important, and you probably do it in your class, to bring in certain modern illustrators. I was thinking of Tom Phillips, for example, who was, of course, behind the BBC version of Dante, for which 8 cantos were done, and they are very provocative in many ways. But even more so is the edition, translation, and illustration by Sando Burke, who does a lot with what we would call today multiculturalism, or multilingualism, or even multi-spatialism, in the sense that it's no longer simply Italy, but it's all around the world. It's Los Angeles, it's New York, it's San Francisco, it's Mecca, it's everywhere. And for Allison, I really enjoyed. I haven't really looked at the Bang translation, but it looks fascinating. And you're probably aware of other new translations. Clive James, for example, who uses not the tercet form but the quatrain form, which I find interesting. But when you were talking about creative writing, I was thinking that there probably is no greater creative writer than Dante himself, because of his neologisms that he uses, that he invents in Paradise in particular, but also the unprecedented imagery that we find that he has to invent, as it were, to get his points across. And I couldn't get over the fact that all the poets who translate Dante, or who do their own Dante, as it were, it's really sort of acting out of Harold Bloom and the anxiety of influence. They're all in awe of Dante, but they're always trying to do something better. They're trying to be one up on the great poet. Anyway, those are just observations, and you can just say that I appreciate very much, in fact, all three of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Does anyone have any lingering questions or comments? If not, I think we've gone just quite a bit over an hour, 10 and 10 minutes at this point. Going once, going twice. Okay, thank you all for attending. And have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, as the case may be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
It was
you.
great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you all.
We're down to 8 participants. 7.
The countdown.
There are many versions of Carlos Dues, because in our department chat, he shared his link, his actual registration link.
I was
I saw it
wondering what was going
afterwards.
on.
Yeah, I saw it because I saw it after. I was like, okay.
How many Carlos?
It was the whole
So
English
many.
department under the name Carlos Dues. It was Carolina, Alessandro.
Which isn't a bad thing, considering he's such a nice guy.
Yeah, and he couldn't make it. because he texted
The
me
world
earlier.
needs a proliferation of Carlos Dues.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Tom Bailey wants to stay and chat with us, I guess.
I think so. I don't know. Maybe he left the computer.
Probably, yeah.
Okay, well, thanks you guys. I think it went well.
Thank you.
And I didn't want to interject and bring in my own comments, but job well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim.
No,
Thank you so much, Alison. No, grazie a voi, guys.
It was really nice to work with you both. I wish we got to like teach a class together.
Beautiful.
Likewise, oh, it would be nice. We
Let's
should do
do that.
co-teaching.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about that. What do you think?
Yeah,
Can
I would
try
love to do that.
I think JCU has had a long-standing
they don't do
aversion
it.
to co-teaching.
Oh, we're still
No.
recording. We can stop that.
Oh, yes, we can.
I'm gonna stop it.